Welcome to Capital Gains, Yahoo Finance's unique look at how US government policy will affect your bottom line long after the presidential election polls have closed. So coming up this week, we saw from Vice President Kamala Harris unveiling a new plan within her so-called opportunity economy, putting some color on it when it comes to manufacturing. So we'll be hearing more about that. And also trying to really break down how that differs from former President Trump's plans as well. Also later on, we're going to be hearing from former governor of Vermont and former chair of the DNC, Howard Dean. He'll be joining us to break down the current state of play in this election. But first, of course, got to bring in my co-stars, Ben Wershkul and Rick Newman here to look at what they've been focusing on this week and where we're headed. So Ben, if you can kick things off for us.
For sure. Yeah. So this week, another week of a lot of economic talk. I counted up, and Trump had 3 speeches on the economy that his campaign billed as on the economy. Harris had 1, but she billed it as a major economic address. So I feel like that balances out. So we did learn a few things this week, mostly on manufacturing. Harris laid out her plan on that. As you mentioned, it's the 3rd pillar of her opportunity economy. And what it is essentially a lot of government involvement in specific sectors that she calls sectors for the future. She name checked a few: biomanufacturing, aerospace, quantum computing, places like that you can sort of imagine if you work in those sectors or you invest in those sectors, a President Harris would have a keen interest. Exactly what that intervention would look like. Is it another CHIPS Act? Is it something else? That remains to be seen. For Trump, in his speeches, he kind of reiterated his manufacturing policy, which is essentially a sort of wall around the country in the form of tariffs. He calls it a ring around the country. And then if for anyone inside that wall, they get a lot less government intervention, less regulations, less taxes, things like that to build up manufacturing that way. So it's kind of the same end goal, but in sort of pretty different means. Two other quick things we learned this week, I think, is a continuation of a kind of business-friendly Kamala that we've seen. In her speech, she talked about permitting reform. I'm skeptical that a lot of swing state voters are focused on that, but I can tell you a lot of CEOs, when she did it, I was like, oh, I bet Mark Cuban's going to really like this. And then, of course, when he was on TV later, that was the first thing he talked about was permitting reform. So there's things like that are kind of under the radar that are sort of her attempt to kind of get in with the business community more. And then the last one, just quickly, is on Trump, is a kind of willingness of him this week to name and shame companies. The one that got a lot of attention was John Deere. He was at an event, he saw a John Deere tractor and was reminded that John Deere has talked about moving to Mexico. He kind of off the cuff promised 200% tariffs on everything John Deere produces. So that's a trend that I think is interesting to watch, and whether that continues in terms of whether he goes after more companies more, which obviously could affect those companies and their share prices.
Ben, I love that you're channeling Mark Cuban. You should tell us what he's going to say next week and the week after that. So every time Trump talks, his tariff number gets higher, doesn't it? He started out with 10% universal tariff. I think then he said it was going to be 20%.
Sometimes in the same speech. Yeah, in the same speech, he'll go 100% and then 200%.
I mean, he must think, like 60% isn't high enough. 100% on electric vehicles isn't high enough. It needs to be 200%. We're going to start hearing 500%. I hope everybody knows that the higher Trump's tariffs go, the worse they are going to be on ordinary Americans. There's almost no economist who thinks this is a good idea. And it is a tax that is going to raise prices for everybody. I just feel like we need to keep reiterating this, because it's remarkable that Trump is proposing major tax hikes on voters, and he still is competitive in this race. Hard to believe. The Peterson Institute for International Economics has a new update on how much Trump's tariffs, if partially imposed, if fully imposed, how much they would cut GDP and how much they would push inflation up. What kind of politician runs on that as the base of his economic plan? I mean, it's kind of remarkable. Just to go back to Harris, she gave her so-called major economic address in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm from Pittsburgh. I'm a former Yinzer. And I just want to ask Bill this question. How many people out there, raise your hand if you think Pittsburgh is a major manufacturing city? Nope, hands down. It used to be a major industrial city, but my hometown, Pittsburgh, now the things that drive that economy are technology based around Carnegie Mellon University and all the offshoots there, and healthcare. There still is some steel industry there, but as in many other parts of the country, manufacturing economy is a small part of the economy in Pittsburgh, also in Pennsylvania, and nationally, it's just 8% of all jobs. And yet, we've got these two candidates just hammering on manufacturing as if that's the only part of the economy that matters. Now, of course, they have singled out workers who get paid in tips. They're going to get a benefit, a SOP here for that person. But, most people work in like business services. Where's the giveaway? Where's the candy for business service workers or retail workers or healthcare workers? I mean, I guess I know the answer to this. It's targeted at, there are still a few swing voters in the manufacturing business in the Midwest, in Pennsylvania and other states, but they're way sort of off to the side of where the major parts of the economy are.
It's true. And one of the things that I was looking at when I was hearing from both of them is how directly are they really addressing some of these economically distressed people and places? Because, I mean, we talk about manufacturing, we talk about tariffs, but, for a lot of the technology that a lot of these big tech companies want to bring here, that also means you have to have good international trade relations as well. So it's that combination of sort of alienating some trade partners or some industries while also, talking about tariffs. How does this actually play out then for the typical US consumer, do you think?
I mean, I'll take a stab at that. I think Kamala Harris, I think her campaign has made a very deliberate choice not to get too specific about policy ideas. I mean, she certainly has dribbled some things out. What they won't say is she's basically going to be the same as Biden with a few little differences. But they seem to think, and they might be right, that she has risen in the polls simply because people like her more than Donald Trump, and that they may jeopardize that if they get too specific with policy ideas. So I think that is a deliberate choice. Eggheads like us, we want to see all the footnotes and stuff like that. And, the think tank analysis saying it's a good idea, it's a bad idea. I don't think we're going to get it. I don't know what voters are going to think. We should ask our guests later.
Right. Well, I had one thing to add to that. When you talk to the campaign and when you talk to Democrats in general, they would say a version of what you just said, Rick. What their view of what voters want is less policy specifics. They're not going to care about this amount of the tax credit versus another. What voters in their view want, and we'll see if it's right, what the Democrats say, is they want a candidate. They want to hear a candidate just talking about these issues and showing that they care. It's sort of the message "I care" thing. So when Harris gives this speech, there's new information in here for us, but it's within a larger speech that's just sort of an attempt to sort of to talk about our biography and talk about policy she's already unveiled. So there's this element here of just sort of by being out there and by talking about it, that's a win for them in their view, at least. We'll see if it's true.
When she in the Pittsburgh speech, she said, I think she said, I'm a capitalist, and then she said, I'm a pragmatist. I think her message to the business community is it's just going to be more. If I'm the president, it's going to be the status quo. So what the government is right now, and it's basically going to be the same, maybe even a little more centrist than the Biden administration. You mentioned permitting reform. That benefits green energy, but it also benefits fossil fuel delivery, including pipelines, which we need to get gas around the country. So she does sound a little bit more centrist than Biden on that. I'm not sure it's enough of a difference to really matter, though.
We'll certainly have to wait and see, but we do have to put a pin in it just for now as we head to a quick break. And obviously on the other side of this break, we will have our guest who will be joining us, former Vermont Governor Howard Dean, and he's also the former chair of the DNC. We'll get his take on how things are ramping up ahead of the election after this. Welcome back to Capital Gains. We're now joined by the former governor of Vermont, Howard Dean. He's also the former chair of the DNC. We really want to get his perspective on how things are ramping up ahead of the presidential election. Great to have you on, Governor. So first, we want to get the lay of the land because obviously in candidate Harris and candidate Trump, they're really trying to appeal to a more moderate base, it feels like. So this economic populism, though, is it working? And is that the right strategy for either one of them?
It's probably the right strategy. Whether it would actually work in practice or not is another matter. There was a very interesting analysis of what it would be if you really did not tax tips. And it's kind of topsy-turvy, and it's not clear that it's a big advantage to anybody except maybe bartenders that make $100,000 a year in tips. So there's a lot of, you can't, I don't take seriously what most people propose in campaigns, except for the broad brush stuff. What I'm mostly interested in is defense policy, healthcare policy, the extent that the federal government engages in serious healthcare policy, which they usually don't, with the exception of President Obama. So, it's very hard to dissect the rhetoric of a campaign on either side because it's all poll driven.
Hey, Governor, Rick Newman here. I have not interviewed you before, so first thing I want to say is I loved the Scream in 2004. I thought it was not remotely disqualifying. I hope you trademarked it and managed to make some money off it. I think that would be completely normal in 2024. But there is a question.
I did make some money. I did make some money off it, but what was disqualifying is was finishing third in the Iowa caucuses when I was supposed to finish first. That was what was disqualifying.
Good. I'm glad you turned that into a brand. So we were talking before you joined about Kamala Harris. It seems to be a very deliberate element of the campaign that they're not going to get into all these policy specifics. And for eggheads like me and Ben, like our heads explode. We want to see all the analysis of the and what the plan is and all this. But maybe a lot of voters don't. I mean, so do you think that's a smart way to go? Do you think that's risky? And do you see a coherent strategy with that?
The coherent strategy is people mostly vote on whether they like you or not. And that does not usually have a lot to do with specific policies. The biggest policy that's caused trouble for Trump in this issue or this time around is abortion. And so you're finding him all over the lot on that. And that's probably not that helpful to him, although I've not seen the poll results on that. The other thing that Trump has got against him is his sort of reputation of a guy who's exhausting and who's going to say all kinds of crazy things. And I think one of the reasons Biden beat Trump in 2020 is because Trump is exhausting. Whether he's exhausting this time around too. And I think the conscious thing that Kamala is doing that I think is really smart is not be exhausting, just be somebody who's preparing to be president of the United States and that most people can relate to. It's a smart tactic, and the polls are very, very close. So who knows who's going to win?
Governor, a policy question for you. You mentioned healthcare in your first answer. I'm curious kind of how you're thinking about that for next year, in either scenario of who wins. What's the sort of major issue in 2025 for the next president? Is it these Obamacare subsidies, these enhanced subsidies, and what would that look like if those expire?
I don't think Congress is going to touch healthcare in a serious way. The problem with healthcare is it's 20% of the economy of the largest economy in the world. And the incentives are upside down. You get incentivized in healthcare to spend as much as you possibly can, which has been very successful for the last 50 years. In order to fix that, you basically have to go to capitated care 100% of the time. You can't continue with fee for service. It's a complete loser. And now that 20% of our economy is tied up in healthcare, every possible interest group works against the other interest group to make sure they can preserve their share. What I've suggested in Vermont is that our big teaching hospital start its own insurance company. All of a sudden, then the incentives get flipped upside down, and you get make money by not doing all kinds of expensive things to people. And it's much more complicated than that. But I do not think that you can win an election based on healthcare explaining the policy. I do think you can be sympathetic to people struggling with healthcare costs because it's really killing a lot of families. And I think the Democrats have the advantage in general on healthcare.
So when it comes to some of these kitchen table issues, obviously, healthcare, very expensive, but also tax credits when it comes to childcare and small business tax credits. Is all of that null and void because we don't know the makeup of Congress yet and we don't know to what degree some of this will be pushed through? Why is it still important to really break some of those things down?
Well, I think that there is some possibility for some bipartisan work in Congress. I mean, it's not what's been going on since Gingrich took over years ago and set the tone of negativism and hating your opponent. But there are, I think we've lost some terrific people in Congress who are Republicans who really know a lot about healthcare. And I think there is an appetite, for example, to restore the childhood tax credit, which lifted 50% of the kids who were in poverty out of poverty, which is incredible. So I actually do think there's an appetite on the Republican side to do something, probably not in the majority, not the people who are harassing poor Mike Johnson all the time and not letting him get anything done. But I do think it's possible to have some bipartisan votes on Congress on stuff that's not that expensive, and that really will make a difference in the lives of the constituencies of both parties.
Governor Dean, just go back to what you said, something you said there about healthcare. So we're not likely to get much additional action at the federal level on healthcare. Well, you talked about that experiment in Vermont. Is that the kind of thing that could actually make a difference at the regional level, let's say, that where in areas and states or even cities, the big cities where there's an interest in doing this, you could do this, like basically compete with private sector insurers from a public organization. Is that plausible?
I think it's plausible. I think it's really plausible. Look, in my view, insurance companies mostly take money out of the system and keep some of it and then give it back. There's no reason not to do that. I mean, Kaiser has proved that you can be your own insurance company and manage risk much, much better. You know, I'm not a huge fan of government running things. I think they're not that efficient. But I'm also not a huge fan in our system today of private sector running things, because they've run the cost up 2 or 3 times the rate of costs of everything else that are going on. So why not let the nonprofit sector, like Kaiser or like the Medical Center Hospital of Vermont, run its own insurance company, assess for its own risk? They can get some actuarial expertise. And they can get reinsurance, which they're going to need, and be in the business themselves and cut out the insurance industry. There's no reason for them to. They don't bring anything to the table.
Governor, one more issue for you. I'd love to bring up, especially going back to 2004. Actually, you know, one thing I'm old enough to have covered that campaign as well, and one thing I think people forget about your message then, and also your record in Vermont, was how much fiscal responsibility you were focused on, how much balancing the budget was important, and the message there won. Curious, kind of in that context, bring that to today. Should Kamala Harris be talking more about that? How should the debt be discussed on the campaign right now?
Doesn't seem that that's a, you know, I mean, the biggest deficit that was ever run was run by Donald Trump, who cut taxes for people who are making $1 gazillion a year, and that caused an enormous deficit. And the next 3 biggest were both Bushes and Reagan. So that didn't seem to hurt the Republican Party any. So, you know, I think you have to mouth platitudes about the deficit. I think we have to do something about the deficit. But talking about how you're going to fix it, the specifics are poison for anybody, and that's why nobody ever does anything about it.
Right.
And Governor, I do want to ask what this is going to come down to. Who do you think is going to win? When you think of some of these undecided voters, independents, economically distressed, you have Teamsters and, you know, some of these unions that haven't weighed in on any of this yet. Based on what you're seeing right now, who is most likely to win between Trump and Harris?
I think it's going to be Kamala, and I think the big piece is Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Nevada. I think we'll probably win the so-called blue wall. But I think the really tough states are going to be Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Nevada. It would be nice to win Arizona. I think we have a decent shot in Arizona because we have a very, very strong Senate candidate, and they have a very, very weak Senate candidate. But that's where I believe. Georgia, I think it's possible to win. We're going to need a little help there. But I'm pretty optimistic that Kamala Harris is going to be the next president of the United States.
Thank you so much for joining us,
problem.
Governor. It's been great having you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Governor.
A big thank you to Governor Dean for joining us here on Capital Gains. Right, as we look ahead, we know October's right around the corner. And so we're looking for some of these so-called October surprises that typically tend to come up, and especially in these few weeks before Election Day. So let's first start with some of the ones that are the most likely at this point. What do we know so far from what we're reading? Ben, I want to kick things off with you about some of the most likely October surprises.
Yeah. So this Tobin Marcus at Wolf Research, who is a friend of the pod and been on Yahoo Finance before, had a good list that I think is a good starting point. I have one to add to it, but I'll run through his really quick. He had 2 that I think we can kind of cross off at this point based on the events of this week. One is election rule changes. You know, this is a focus on Nebraska and whether they're going to change their electoral vote. They seem to not going to be changing their rules. So that seems off the table. The other one is the government shutdown. That's been averted as of last night. The House and Senate passed it. So that's not going to happen until after the election, although that'll ramp up then. He had 2 more that are kind of in the ether and we don't kind of know what the effect. One is the vice presidential debate. That's next on October 1st. So Tim Walz and JD Vance will meet together. Historically, those outside of a Jack Kennedy moment, those don't necessarily break through, but we don't know this year, especially with these kind of two unknown VP candidates. So that's one that's on his list that I think is a good one we'll be watching for sure. And the other one kind of that's also happening the same day is the East Coast port strike. So that's if there's a strike, it kicks off October 1st as well. The economic effects there could be mixed. Biden could step in and sort of put an 18-day cooling off period. So that could slow things down. So that's one that may have an effect, but also may just get punted. He had two more real quickly. One is a wider war in the Middle East, which we're kind of in the midst of right now. We'll see if that breaks through. And then the other one I think is an important one to watch is these hacked documents from the Trump campaign. There's an actor that has these documents. They've been trying to sell them to the media, and so far the media has not pushed it forward, but there's clearly an issue of wanting to have it out there. And so we'll see what that looks like, whether there's stuff in there that changes people's minds in the next month. So those are his six. The one more I'd add real quickly is just economic numbers. We're going to get two more jobs reports and one more inflation number. If those are steady as they go, it probably doesn't matter. But if there is a switch, this is the time when it kind of could change voters' mind. I'm put of mind earlier this year where it seemed like inflation might be stalling. If that happens a month before election, it's a very different picture than in January when people forget it a few months later.
I'll push back on a couple of those, but add a couple of others. Anything that might be in these Trump campaign documents supposedly hacked by the Iranians, what could we possibly learn about Trump that would be more salacious than everything we already know about Trump? We're certainly not going to learn that he's like much more of a Santa Claus in private than anybody ever knew. It would only be more allegations of corruption. I don't know that they would add anything to the public perception of Trump. East Coast port strike, Biden has the power to keep that from happening before the election. I think he will do that if it comes to it, and that won't affect most people. Here's one that Tobin did not mention. We've had 2 assassination attempts against Trump in 3 months, and we've still got 5-6 weeks left. I mean, what is going on with the Secret Service? And Trump is still going around to golf courses and still holding rallies. That could happen. And just to go back to the Middle East, Iran said it was going to attack Israel again after presumably Israel, assassinated that senior Hamas official in Tehran. And not a thing has happened. In fact, that whole thing has gone the other way, with Iran on its back heels, trying to figure out how Israel can, set off bombs in the middle of Tehran whenever it wants to, apparently. And now Israel basically doing a preemptive attack on Hezbollah. I mean, this does not necessarily mean that this is all going to settle in Israel's favor, but this has gone quite a different direction than anybody guessed, 2 months ago, when Iran basically said, "We're coming after you, Israel." And everybody thought, well, is this going to be worse than the last time they did this? What's going to happen? So that could go any direction at any time. And I guess one other, I guess because now Biden has dropped out, nobody is talking about a potential health issue before the election. I guess because people think Trump is healthy enough that it's not a concern. I wouldn't take that for granted. Trump looks pretty old. He looks pretty haggard sometimes. So something could still happen there.
I mean, and it's true. It's hard because a lot of people have already sort of dug their heels in on who they're already going to support. I'll certainly see it does tend to be a double-edged sword, trying to get the benefits and then some of the drawbacks that come with it. We will have to leave it there. That is it for this episode of Capital Gains. Of course, you can always catch us here, Ben, Rick, and myself on Capital Gains. A big thank you, of course, to Governor Dean for joining us as well. That does it for now, but we'll see you next time on Yahoo Finance.
Thanks, guys. See you.
See you later.